I feel like this map inadvertently says a lot about the relationship that New York City has with Staten Island. Like, it's there, but it's tucked away in the corner, and it's completely deceptive of its size. And I know that this is more a diagram than an actual map, but it played a large role in shaping my perception of Staten Island, and I'm willing to bet I'm not alone. In reality, Staten Island is longer than Manhattan and larger in land area. It has the longest street in a single borough in the entire city. And even with that, it's known as the Forgotten Borough.
It's a place that people don't really know. They don't really understand the significance of this location.
So I wanted to look a little closer at the map of this Forgotten Borough and see if I could figure out why it's considered forgotten and why it's part of New York. Before working on this video, I had been to Staten Island maybe once or twice, and only because I rode the Staten Island ferry and then immediately turned around and rode it back to Manhattan. Sorry for the delay. I met up with Thomas Mateo, who is the borough historian of Staten Island. He picked me up and wasted no time before getting into the history of the borough.
From Salt Lake City, Utah.
Okay, the building you see in front of you, that's Borough Hall.
Okay. Thomas is just one of the several amazing experts that are helping me with this video.
I'm a retired curator of history from the Staten Island Museum. You know, I always say, what's so fascinating about Staten Island history? And the answer is everything.
Staten Island is one of the 5 boroughs that make up New York City, and it's distinctly different from the rest of them. Not because it's an island, actually, most of New York City lies across several different islands.
Brooklyn and Queens are on an island, Long Island. Manhattan is an island. The Bronx is the only borough who entirely is a part of the mainland of the United States.
But what does set Staten Island apart is its distance from the rest of the city.
The southernmost part of New York State is on Staten Island by the Outer Bridge crossing. It's the southernmost part of New York. You can tell from my accent that we're in South, right?
So this leads me to my first question. Why is Staten Island part of New York City?
If you look at a map, you see how close Staten Island is to New Jersey, right? The Kill Van Kull and the Arthur Kill are minuscule even compared to the Narrows, and let alone, the 5 miles to Manhattan.
The Narrows is the shortest distance between Brooklyn and Staten Island, marking the entrance to the New York harbor. But when I started to look closer at these boundary lines of New York and New Jersey, I started to get a lot more questions. The New York Bay has the islands that Thomas mentioned, like Staten Island, Manhattan, and Long Island, but there's also a bunch of smaller islands. And if you look at Ellis Island and Liberty Island, the borders here are kind of strange. Liberty Island, for example, is in New Jersey, but the island belongs to New York. And Ellis Island has a very strange border, where this part of the island is New York and the rest belongs to New Jersey. The state border cuts through the middle of the Hudson River, down through the Upper Bay, and then takes a sharp turn and encompasses Staten Island. And there are several theories as to why this is.
One popular one was that there was a boat race, and whoever won the boat race would get Staten Island.
Supposedly, if you could circle an island by boat in less than a day, it would belong to New York. And if it took longer than a day, it would belong to New Jersey. The story goes that someone did it in like 23 and a half hours, but this story raises a lot of questions. The YouTube channel CGP Grey made a video trying to verify this, and it's super good. I'll leave it in the description below. But ultimately, this story isn't verifiable. The story of these borders actually goes all the way back to the first European settlers here, the Dutch. I want to take a quick second to thank Headspace for sponsoring this video. And before you skip ahead, if you're planning on skipping ahead, I just want you to know that I love Headspace so much that I reached out to them and asked if they would sponsor one of my videos because I really believe in what they do. Headspace is an app I use to help me with meditation, and I think it's really important to prioritize your mental health and to just take some space, process things, and think. I've been reflecting a lot on last year, and I had a pretty rough patch emotionally and mentally, and I found a lot of comfort and use in the meditations on Headspace. They have meditation courses on work stress, on creativity, working through a breakup, and I think the one I use the most is the sleep meditations. I use them at night to fall asleep, and it always helps me fall asleep quickly and have a good night's rest. I can say this from personal experience that using Headspace is proven to decrease stress and increase happiness. You can use the link at the top of the description or scan the QR code on the screen for 60 days free on Headspace and see how it can help you. Huge thank you to Headspace. I genuinely love their product, and I think you will too. Okay, back to the video about Staten Island. After making a couple videos about Manhattan and Brooklyn, I decided I wanted to make one on each borough. In the Brooklyn video, I talked a bit about the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam and New Netherland, and I recommend checking out that video for a little bit of context before the rest of this one. These boundary lines go back to the Dutch, but they weren't the first ones here.
The history goes back to pre-Lenape times, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of history.
What we know of Staten Island is it's largely inhabited by the Raritan. The Raritan are the ones who are mentioned the most in the documents, but the Tappans are probably intersecting in there. There's not really major villages on Staten Island. It's these small encampments that are there seasonally. There are a few burials that are found on Staten Island that have some pretty exotic trade goods that are found. Shells coming from coastal Florida.
Drew helped me understand a bit of what Staten Island was like when the Dutch arrived.
My name is Drew Shepter-Ravis. I'm a living historian of the 17th and 18th century. I'm a citizen and cultural ambassador of the Pocomoke Indian Nation. We are a small, unrecognized tribal community in the state of Maryland. For New Amsterdam History Center as their Algonquian historical consultant. So what we know of Staten Island is that it is called Aquayongamanaknong, the place of bad woods. Could be talking about that there's not a ton of fresh water that's there.
The Dutch were obviously the first people to meet up with the Lenape when they landed on Staten Island. And they set up a little colony at a place called the Watering Place, which is where Tompkinsville is. And it didn't last because there was a war with the Lenape. Then there were 2 more attempts at permanent settlement. And those 2 ended with war with the Lenape. And finally, in 1661, it was petitioned to set up a permanent settlement on Staten Island. And that settlement was later called Old Dorp, which means Old Town. But it had no name until New Dorp was established. So it became Odorp. And in present-day Staten Island, it's called Arrow Car. Nobody really uses the term Odorp anymore, but they do say New Dorp.
Although the neighborhood is now called Arrow, there is a stop on this singular train line called Old Town. And a few stops to the south is a stop called New Dorp. Dorp is the old Dutch term for town, and it's just one of the many Dutch terms that stuck, including Staten Island, which is named for the Staats-General, which is the governing body of the Netherlands. Another legacy of the Dutch is Toad Hill. Toad meaning death. In my Brooklyn video, I talked about the terminal moraine, which are the hills that were left behind by a glacier that led to the placement of places like Prospect Park and Greenwood Cemetery, and that crosses over into Staten Island, and Toad Hill is part of that. At 410 feet high, it actually marks the tallest point along the entire Atlantic coast south of Maine.
Some people think there may have been some kind of a battle between Native Americans and the early settlers up there, and that's why it's called Toad Hill.
But the Dutch term that still reaches across most of New Netherland is the Dutch term for waterway, kills. In upstate New York, you have Beaver Kill and the Catskill Mountains, but on Staten Island, you have places like the Fresh Kills or Great Kills Harbor. And the Arthur Kill and Kill Van Kull are anglicized versions, meaning essentially the back waterway. This map shows the 1655 Dutch claim of New Netherland. The English had colonies on either side of New Netherland, and they knew the value of the New York Bay. Their motives were different than the Dutch. The English were there to set up a colony and expand their power and their influence, while the Dutch was really there mostly just for commercial reasons to make some money.
The Dutch always were lacking in settlers. They never had a huge population. The English always outnumbered them.
So when the English sailed into the bay in 1664 and told the Dutch they were taking it, the Dutch didn't put up much of a fight because they didn't really stand a chance. The English renamed New Amsterdam New York, and this is when the split between New York and New Jersey began. But the borders were very vague. When King Charles II acquired New Netherland, he gave it to his brother James.
He is the Duke of York. That's why it's named New York.
In turn, James gave a portion of this land to his friends. This was the birth of New Jersey. But the description of the border was just that it was bounded on the east part by the main sea and part by Hudson's River. Pretty vague. Control over the region switched back and forth between the Dutch and English for a while they fought some of those really cool-looking naval battles. But ultimately, they had to ask King George to come back and verify if Staten Island was part of New Jersey or New York. And he said that it was part of New York.
If Staten Island was part of New Jersey instead of New York, any commerce and any taxes on that commerce would have to be shared by both states. And why would you want to do that?
But the boundary lines of Staten Island and Ellis Island were still unclear. And this actually led to disputes all the way up till 1998. The Supreme Court decided that all of the man-made land belonged to New Jersey, while all of the original land belonged to New York. So this boundary shows you which part of the island is man-made and which isn't. For hating on each other so much, they really have a hard time deciding which part they hate. But the story of becoming part of New York City is a different one. That wouldn't happen for another 200 years after the English got it from the Dutch. During the first 100, the English controlled Staten Island, and they called it the County of Richmond. At the center, they established a town called Richmond Town.
Richmond was the
The Duke of Richmond was because the Duke of York,
nephew or duke.
that's who it's named for. It's the Duke of Richmond, who was the nephew of Charles II, and that's why it becomes Richmond Town.
Well, this was the original county seat for the province back in colonial days. And it would make sense because in those days, this was primarily an agricultural community. So there were many farms and there wasn't very many dense populated areas. So the city government was right in the middle of the borough, very close to the middle of the borough. So it was equidistant to all parts. There was also an inlet from the water to here, and ships would actually come up here. But over time, with silt developing, it became unnavigable. But ships actually came all the way in here, so it was a perfect location for the city government.
Staten Island is still the county of Richmond, but it was actually officially the borough of Richmond all the way up until 1975 before it was renamed. One of my favorite things, though, is that the English also called Richmond Town Cuckold Town. Supposedly, this is rooted in the word cockles, referring to oysters, but either way, I'm happy it's on this map. Richmond Town is now a historic site that's actually been pretty well preserved.
This has many of the old buildings and one of the oldest buildings on the island and in the city here. Some were moved here, some were originally here.
Historic Richmond Town will give you that feel of what Staten Island might have looked like 100, 200 years ago. And it gives you like a flavor of what that might have been. So when the English come, one of the things that they tell the Indians is that, you know, all of the problems you've had with the Dutch are in the past now. We are a new man. We are a new people. And consider all of those problems you had with the Dutch, let it be forgotten.
This is also the time when the last Native Americans were displaced from Staten Island. During these 100 years, it remained pretty undeveloped and was mostly just farms, so there was no dramatic increase in population. But it did begin to see a lot of activity shortly after the colonies declared independence.
1776 in early July, tens of thousands of British troops came into the New York harbor and they settled on Staten Island, and it became the home place for the British Army in the New York City area.
As the conflict gained momentum, there was an attempt to stop the Revolutionary War right here at the Conference House in modern-day Tottenville.
Built by and for Christopher Billop about 1680. This house was long a center of colonial hospitality. It is known also as Conference House because Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Edward Rutledge met here with Lord Howe at his request on September 11, 1776, in an unsuccessful effort to halt the American Revolution.
Lord Admiral Richard Howe said to them, if the colonies would just come back into the fold and pledge allegiance to the king, all will be forgiven, and there will be no, you won't be reprimanded, you won't be taxed any further, you won't be punished. Just come back and all will be forgiven.
Obviously, that didn't happen, and during the war, the English occupied Staten Island. They fortified a pre-existing Dutch fortification near the Narrows that actually continued in operation all the way up till 1994, making it the longest continuously used military installation in the United States.
And those are the casements where they had most of the artillery. And there was a sister fort on the other side, Fort Lafayette. And that was where the towers to the Brooklyn side of the bridge are now resting.
After independence, there would still be another 100 years before Staten Island was part of New York City. During this time, Staten Island was the birthplace of Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the first self-made tycoons in the new country. By controlling and consolidating large networks of railroads and shipping, he became one of the wealthiest men in the world during the 1800s. And being from Staten Island, it's easy to see what pointed him in that direction.
Staten Island, being an island, has always had ferries all the way around. There were no bridges until a railroad bridge opened up in the late 1880s. Manhattan, Brooklyn, and New Jersey were always the markets for Staten Island's goods. So the ferries were always playing a very important role in the lives of Staten Islanders because it was a farming community. It was an agricultural community until the early 1800s when industry started popping up along the North Shore and the East Shore. So the ferries were important in bringing people back and forth, but especially for the farmers.
When he was only 16, Vanderbilt started his own ferry company. And later, his son played a large role in trying to connect Staten Island to New York by rail. We looked at this population graph in the Brooklyn video, but I want to look at it again. You can see that while the population of Brooklyn and Manhattan grew quickly during these 100 years, Staten Island's increased slowly along with the other boroughs, since it was primarily focused on farming and small-scale manufacturing. Also during this time, the neighborhood right here, known as Sandy Ground, began to develop as one of the earliest free black communities in the U.S.
The Dutch had a lot of slaves in the New York City area. It's a matter of a fact of the 17th century. It was considered daily life, but it's one that I think historians gloss over because it's ugly.
As far as I'm concerned, there have been enslaved people on Staten Island, before even permanent settlement.
Despite being devastated by fire in 1963, Sandy Ground is still home to some of the descendants of its original founders. Also, because Staten Island is relatively close to the city and has these big hilly bluffs, it became a popular spot for wealthy New Yorkers to build summer homes. A lot of these houses are still standing in the St. George area, and they're beautiful and have incredible views of the city. This is where the answer to both of my questions starts to blend into one.
Staten Island becoming part of the city of New York is only even on the table because Staten Island's already a part of New York State. My name is Ken Gold. I'm a historian of American urban education. I have been teaching at the College of Staten Island, where I currently serve as a full professor, and I'm the author of the 2023 publication, The Forgotten Borough, Staten Island and the Subway.
The city boundary as we know it was created in 1898, when all of the cities and towns within the area were consolidated into one.
And then after consolidation, they moved the county seat, which is the seat of government, to St. George by the ferry because of its proximity to Manhattan.
This is where Borough Hall is, the first building that was pointed out to me after getting off the ferry. Consolidation was largely the result of the efforts of Andrew Haswell Green, who wanted to create a single governmental entity that would control the harbor.
In our lifetime, right, free markets get presented as the mechanism for efficiency, and sort of the public sector gets, presented as this bloated, inefficient entity. But 120 years ago, Andrew Haswell's Greens was exactly the opposite. His geographic vantage point was the harbor of New York City. And if that's your vantage point, and you look at the harbor, then the entrance to that harbor, right, is the narrow strait, and Staten Island lies at that entrance. And that's why he always included it in his proposal to consolidate New York, and fought to keep it when at one point there were some Manhattanites who were pushing for its exclusion.
Staten Islanders expected a lot of benefits from joining the city.
I think the people of Staten Island voted to become part of the city of New York because they expected that the city would help the borough advance and improve.
Staten Island was hoping that as part of New York City, they would get a lot of municipal funds for sewers, roads, and the like.
You can see the growth of Queens and the Bronx shortly after consolidation. They both enjoyed the benefits of being part of the city and being linked with the subway system. But Staten Island was never connected to the subway.
It leads to kind of a level of isolation, right? The city, it's economic isolation in terms of its economic development. It's, fewer people moving here. It's cultural isolation. I'm always amazed at how many students I've taught that I teach that have never been to Manhattan.
The one line we see on today's subway map was a rail line built 50 years before the subway.
Staten Island is further than the other boroughs, and so I don't think it would have become as populous as Queens or the Bronx, but I think it would have hit 500,000 decades ago instead of still not quite being there.
What's striking for me to learn about the development of Staten Island is just how recent it's been.
Yeah, I mean, I lived through it. I lived through the so-called farming period on Staten Island.
When I moved here in '79, there was an active farm, and as I was driving to a friend's house, I saw a herd of cows grazing on the Staten Island Mall, the grass of the mall, as late as '79.
Staten Island is still easily the most rural borough. And I know this is a weird way to measure it, but when I was poking around on Google Maps, I kept seeing all these swimming pools. So I looked it up and I found this map. Staten Island is a clear outlier. Look at all of these ground pools. Obviously, there could be multiple reasons for this, but the fact that there's space to do it, I think says something. Although the undeveloped landscape marked its distance from the rest of the city, it also became a point of pride for the Staten Islanders. It felt like a small neighborhood town with a lot of greenery.
If you ever saw the towns of Travis and Tottenville back in the 1960s, you would have thought you were out in the Midwest.
Efforts to preserve this led to the Green Belt, this large green area in the center of the island. And I want to point out an interesting landmark in the center of this nature preserve. This is the site of Seaview Hospital, the nation's largest tuberculosis facility. And it was specifically built here because the cure to tuberculosis was believed to be sunshine and fresh air.
You're up to here this high, you're going to get a lot of fresh air and a lot of sunshine. And originally there were 8 hospitals buildings built, 4 for female, 4 for male, which was interesting. They segregated the sexes in those days. We're talking about 1910, 1911. Since we're in a very isolated part of the city, there weren't many housing out there for staff. So most of the staff lived right here on this campus.
The history of this facility is super interesting and pretty creepy. Whoa.
Yeah.
That spooked me.
Yeah, I know. Right?
I wasn't ready for that.
But this is one of the original gurneys. This is a display of some of the tools they used during the tuberculosis days. I mean, look at this saw. This was used to cut bone. They also had a fetus once that is no longer here because that was getting people upset.
Anyway, the lack of subway begins to explain the reason this was the forgotten borough. But there's a couple other major reasons, and I'll give you 3 seconds to guess who's responsible for them. Robert Moses, the weirdly powerful Parks Commissioner.
And then Mr. Moses, in 1948, said, we are putting a landfill on Staten Island in the Fresh Kills. We're going to call it the Fresh Kills landfill. They didn't use the word dump. And at that point, people were still interested in filling up wetlands. They thought wetlands were useless.
And for the next 50 years, the Fresh Kill wetlands were transformed into the world's largest landfill. right on Staten Island.
The landfill represented this idea of you never do think about us unless it's to sort of build something that nobody else wants.
The other thing Moses did was the most impactful thing to happen to Staten Island, probably ever.
Now, I'm not going to call it achievement, but the crowning event was the opening of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge between Brooklyn and Staten Island, which changed Staten Island forever.
The Verrazano Narrows Bridge was the longest suspension bridge in the world when it was built, and the population of Staten Island has more than doubled since then.
The population exploded around the time the bridge was built, and the Staten Islanders are usually divided into before the bridge and after the bridge, folks. The bridge went up in '64. The influx started a little bit before the bridge, people anticipating it being built and being finished, but that exploded after the bridge, because now the access you can get across the bridge in 5 minutes, as opposed to taking the ferry, which was from Brooklyn was more than a half an hour.
People didn't realize, and when I say people, I mean the people who are native Staten Islanders, they didn't realize the changes that were going to occur. They didn't realize that this somewhat bucolic setting was going to practically change overnight. And they developed a very strong resentment towards Moses, towards people who moved from Brooklyn, and there were thousands of us who moved from Brooklyn because of the bridge. I don't want to call it hatred, but that dislike of Brooklynites and Moses and the changes that have occurred is still present. I mean, it's, the 60th anniversary of the opening of the bridge, and it's still present, because that's the mindset of the native Staten Islanders, is that Moses and the Brooklynites destroyed Staten Island.
Verrazano was an Italian explorer who first entered the harbor, and so therefore they named it after him.
But there was a typo, I guess?
Well, the person who ordered the signs didn't research the correct spelling of Verrazano. I think it has 2 R's and 2 Z's, and they left one of the letters out. That's okay.
The construction of this bridge came along with expressways through the island. The Staten Island Expressway here, the West Shore Expressway, and the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Expressway.
Living through that in the 60s and watching all the old farms disappear and the trees being knocked down and the wetlands being filled in, it was pretty mind-blowing, especially for somebody who already had an interest in history and nature at such a young age.
But the purpose of all of this was more to bypass Manhattan to get to Long Island rather than actually accessing Staten Island itself.
A lot of the Staten Island residents consider Staten Island a flyover country, where people just zip through here to get to New Jersey and parts south. But that's been true since the beginning of time on Staten Island.
There was another expressway that Robert Moses wanted to build, the Richmond Expressway. It would have cut through the center of the Greenbelt. Thanks to conservation groups, it never happened, but you can still see the on and off ramps that were built in anticipation of it. In 1993, the feeling of being the forgotten borough was made crystal clear. This was in stark contrast to the original interest they had in joining the city a century earlier.
In 1894, nearly 4 out of 5 voters, 78%, voted in favor of consolidating with New York City. And then 100 years later, there's a secession movement on Staten Island. It's about 2/3 of the people in the 1993 referendum who say we want to disconnect. So, right, something has transformed in terms of the island's attitude towards the rest of the city.
Ultimately, the state blocked the secession, and the next year, the Fresh Kills landfill was closed. After visiting Staten Island and talking with these experts, I feel like I have answers to my questions.
Some people argue today we should never have joined the city. I don't know whether that have worked or not. But this is a beautiful spot and a very cold spot right now. As the sun sets, it's a beautiful sunset here on the South Shore of Staten Island.
Thank you so much for watching. These videos take a lot of time and a lot of work. So if you've made it to this point, it's kind of offensive if you haven't subscribed, I think, and liked the video. Huge thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. It's linked below if you're interested in supporting me there. Alongside it, you'll find links to the books and sites of all of the experts that helped me. Huge thank you to each of you. You're amazing. One fun fact that didn't fit into the video is the name of Outer Bridge Crossing, which is the bridge right here. It's easy to assume why it's called the Outer Bridge Crossing, but actually, Outer Bridge is someone's last name. And that person had a daughter who went to Bermuda in the 1870s and found a little sport called tennis, and then brought back some equipment and played it on Staten Island, introducing the United States to tennis for the very first time. Thanks for watching. Bye.